Welcome to the debate. We are wading into one of the most critical and, well, frankly, devastating public policy discussions in American life: how to approach the regulation of firearms. The severity of the issue is difficult to overstate. We know that on an average day in America, more than 120 people die by gunfire. Yet, if you look beneath the surface of the crisis, the research foundation is astonishingly thin. One frequently cited finding shows that the federal government spends about $142 on sepsis research for every single dollar spent trying to understand the dynamics of gun violence.
And that lack of foundational data has created a vacuum, which has predictably been filled by deep ideological antagonism. The political landscape is just dominated by two highly organized camps, one consistently advocating for more restrictive laws, and the other demanding more permissive laws based on Second Amendment protections. This environment is what often leads us to conclude that the entire debate is poisoned, an irreconcilable clash of core values.
And yet, recent sophisticated research, notably from the RAND Corporation, revealed a fascinating, almost paradoxical insight. When experts from both the restrictive and permissive camps were surveyed, they shared many of the same high-level objectives. They put the highest priority on preventing firearm homicides, followed closely by preventing firearm suicides. That really challenges the dominant narrative that the two sides are fundamentally disagreeing on why gun policy matters.
And this surprising convergence on goals leads us directly to the central substantive question we have to explore today. Is the deep, persistent division in U.S. gun policy fundamentally rooted in conflicting constitutional principles and cultural values, making it an inherent ideological standoff, or is the disagreement primarily a substantive, an empirical dispute over the actual effects and efficacy of specific policies? Is it a fight over principle or a fight over fact?
I'll be arguing that while the objectives, preventing death, may align on a superficial level, the core division remains deeply ideological. It's rooted in two fundamentally different interpretations of constitutional rights: individual sovereignty and the proper role of the state in ensuring safety.
And I'm going to come at it from a different way. I believe the primary and most critical dissonance lies in factual predictions about policy outcomes. The debate is largely one of how to achieve shared safety goals, not why. I maintain that if we had the robust, non-ambiguous data that currently eludes us, the policy path would become much clearer, regardless of constitutional preference.
I see why you think that the disagreement is merely empirical. I do, given that both sides list preventing homicide as their top priority. But the intensity and the depth of the split on high-profile policies proves that fundamental constitutional and cultural values are the true drivers. We are dealing with a structural conflict: the constitutional right to bear arms versus the demand for maximum public safety. Consider the debate over what are commonly called assault weapon bans. For the restrictive camp, this policy is consistently rated as one of the best mechanisms to reduce lethality in mass casualty events. It's seen as essential. For the permissive camp, however, it is viewed as one of the worst policy ideas, a flagrant, unnecessary infringement on the rights of law-abiding citizens. The core of that opposition is purely ideological. The pro-rights position often frames these bans as targeting, functionally common firearms based on cosmetic features, not true capability. This makes the policy feel like an attack on their identity and constitutional standing. This isn't a small disagreement over a statistical probability. It's a fundamental clash over whose right should be prioritized or even sacrificed when the state seeks to enhance collective security. The views on self-defense are foundational to this ideological split. Pro-rights arguments center on the idea that armed citizens deter crime, acting as the first line of defense, thereby reducing the overall risk of victimization. Pro-control arguments emphasize that limiting access reduces the overall opportunities for misuse, regardless of intent, because introducing more guns into a community inherently increases risk. These are two completely divergent philosophies on the necessary balance between individual liberty and state control.
That's a compelling argument, but I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the disagreement is primarily about constitutional principles when the experts themselves reveal such a strong alignment on their moral and ethical objectives. The why is settled: prevent death. The divergence is purely on the forecast of risks and benefits, which is a technical, factual issue. Let's look again at the specific, measurable policy disagreements cited in the round data. Take the policy of allowing teachers and staff to carry guns in schools. The experts favoring more permissive laws, those usually associated with a strong Second Amendment ideology, thought this policy would be highly effective. They predicted it would reduce mass shootings by a substantial 15%. Conversely, the restrictive group thought it would have no meaningful effect on mass shootings, but would demonstrably increase accidental firearm deaths by 5%. The chasm here isn't over whether the Second Amendment should exist. It's a factual disagreement over risk assessment. The question they are debating is, does increasing the number of guns in a secure environment like a school make people safer or more vulnerable? This relies on predictions about human behavior, criminal motivation, and accident rates. These are measurable, empirical hypotheses, and the reason we have a policy standoff is precisely because the data needed to resolve those conflicting predictions is missing. The underlying objective, safety for everyone, is shared, but the perceived mechanism to achieve that safety is diametrically opposed, and that opposition hinges on verifiable facts. Let's focus on the nature of disagreement on policy efficacy, because I think it perfectly illustrates the empirical disagreement that is driving this policy stalemate. I think framing the disagreement over policy efficacy as merely, ideology wearing empirical clothing really simplifies the problem. Look at the policy split on gun-free zone areas, such as schools or government buildings, where carrying firearms is legally prohibited. One side believes these zones are effective because they eliminate potential weapons, thus preventing homicides within that area. The other side, however, believes they only invite more homicides by clearly identifying vulnerable unarmed targets, effectively posting a sign that says, "No resistance here." This is a classic scientific dispute. Both sides share the outcome goal: prevent homicide in schools. If 5 well-conducted studies showed that statistically, homicides either significantly increased or decreased in these zones, the policy choice might largely resolve itself for most experts, regardless of their position on the Second Amendment. The disagreement isn't about the ideal role of government in the abstract. It's about whether the policy works in reality. If a policy fails its primary objective of enhancing safety, it becomes indefensible, even to those who ideologically prefer it.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. While the dispute over gun-free zones manifests as a factual disagreement, I contend that these specific efficacy predictions are rooted in deeper, often unstated ideological assumptions about human nature and the role of the individual. The empirical prediction that restricting access to weapons will fail is often a defense mechanism for the constitutional right. I mean, if you fundamentally believe that the right to self-defense is essential and that any restriction on it is illegitimate, you are then intellectually predisposed to believe that stricter laws will be futile. You'd conclude that criminals will simply disregard new regulations, making the laws burdensome only for those who obey them, the law-abiding citizen. This prediction acts as the empirical validation for the ideological stance. I want to pose a probing question to your position.
If the risk assessment data were to swing 100% in your favor, suggesting high risk for gun owners and massive homicide reduction from restrictions, would the Second Amendment camp truly abandon their constitutional argument, or would they just dismiss the data as flawed or biased or insufficiently comprehensive because it conflicts with their foundational belief in individual sovereignty? The ideology, I argue, is the primary filter through which all efficacy data must pass. And this connection between ideology and prediction leads us directly to the critical factual dispute over what is called the substitution effect. This truly reveals the philosophical core underlying the empirical forecasts. Pro-rights experts frequently operate on the belief that if tougher policies successfully reduce firearm deaths, many of those deaths would still happen by other highly lethal means. This is the substitution effect argument. Restricting guns only addresses the means used, not the underlying social, mental health, or criminal problem driving the violence. From this perspective, gun control policies are inherently doomed to fail their ultimate goal, reducing total death, because they only exchange one instrument for another. The acceptance of this substitution effect is highly correlated with the ideological position on the Second Amendment because it provides the legal defense with an empirical cloak. It allows the pro-rights camp to argue that gun control policies are ultimately fruitless, even if they succeed in reducing firearm deaths, thus justifying their opposition on the grounds of both rights protection and policy futility.
But whether the substitution effect is real is crucially a question of fact that can and should be resolved through research. This is where the lack of data is most damning. To conversationalize this, the stakes are enormous. If reductions in firearm suicides do in fact bring down total suicides, meaning substitution is minimal, then the argument for restricted access to firearms as a public health measure is empirically validated. If the substitution effect is powerful, meaning people simply switch to pills or hanging when guns are restricted, then the restrictive policy has failed its primary humanitarian objective of saving lives, regardless of any ideological stance. This confirms that both sides agree on the ultimate objective of preventing total homicides and suicides. They simply disagree on the policy mechanism's successory. The RAND research pointed out that the experts in the permissive group thought half of the prevented deaths would still occur by other means, while the restrictive group thought almost every prevented firearm death would be a life saved. The lack of data to answer this specific scientific question about substitution rates is the true impasse that prevents policy convergence. To further challenge the idea that the disagreement is fundamentally ideological, we have to look closely at the areas of expert consensus identified in the research. If the divide were truly based on incompatible constitutional views, an irreconcilable conflict between liberty and collective safety, we would see disagreement across the board, but we don't. Experts in both the restrictive and permissive camps agree on the value of several key policies. Specifically, there is consensus on 3 core areas. First, keeping guns out of the hands of anyone subject to a domestic violence restraining order. Second, requiring felons and others prohibited from owning guns to surrender any they already possess. And third, this really significant finding regarding what was termed a win-win policy, committing resources to prosecute anyone who falsifies paperwork to acquire a gun illegally. The experts agreed that this third measure would reduce homicides, mass shootings, and property crime, with virtually no significant effect on hunting, defensive gun use, or the Second Amendment right to bear arms. Why is focusing on the acquisition process rather than the type of weapon the sweet spot where constitutional concern vanishes? Because the data predicts that the safety objectives are met without infringement on the law-abiding public. This consensus on multiple policy fronts strongly suggests that when the empirical risks are clearly defined, the ideological arguments recede.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because those points of consensus are highly specific. They focus on individuals already prohibited from owning firearms by existing law. Agreement on prosecuting criminals or restraining individuals deemed a clear threat by the courts, like those subject to DV restraining orders, that speaks to a shared objective of crime prevention within long-established legal boundaries. The consensus carefully avoids the core constitutional tension that drives the national debate. We aren't talking about whether a convicted felon can buy a weapon. That's settled. The conflict is over restricting the rights of law-abiding citizens through measures like universal background checks, red flag laws that can temporarily confiscate weapons before a crime is committed, or bans on specific types of firearms. The moment a policy touches the rights of those who have committed no crime, the ideological chasm reappears immediately and violently. The fact that the permissive camp immediately disagrees on policies that affect the general, law-abiding population, such as the efficacy of universal background checks, proves that the disagreement is not merely about facts. It's about the fundamental philosophical tolerance for government intrusion into a constitutional right, regardless of the predicted outcome. The ideological principle acts as the veto on otherwise potentially effective empirical solutions. To summarize my position, the constitutional conflict between the inviolable right to bear arms and the demand for maximal public safety remains the true engine driving the policy divide in the U.S. This core ideological disagreement manifests itself as extreme contradictory disputes over policy tools and efficacy predictions. Until those fundamental principles, individual sovereignty versus state responsibility, are reconciled, or until the Supreme Court provides clear new constraints, We'll continue to see these disputes about risk and efficacy, masking a deeper, underlying ideological standoff.
And putting this all together, the evidence suggests that the largest remaining barrier to convergence is not an ideological opposition to shared objectives like preventing homicide. It is the wide-open opportunity to fill critical research holes and resolve factual disputes. If we had clear, unambiguous data on questions like the true rate of substitution in suicides or the net effects of gun-free zones, the restrictive and permissive camps would force to reassess their policy forecasts. We are disagreeing on facts that are currently unknown, not facts that are fundamentally incompatible with each side's ethical goals.
And that points us back to the surprising finding that started this discussion. Despite the rancorous political climate, experts on both sides genuinely share the same goal of saving lives.
Indeed. Understanding the true nature of the disagreement, whether it is fundamentally one of fact or one of principle, is essential for moving forward. The material suggests that the failure to fund research is not just a financial oversight. It is the fundamental reason why experts who agree on the desired outcome remain entrenched in diametrically opposed policy prescriptions.